Welcome to Kali Tribune podcast. In this episode, we'll talk about lines in the sand. By this I mean lines similar to those that we used to write, so to speak, or inscribe as children on the seashore, on the beach. The lines that sometimes made out elaborate figures just to be erased with the first wave coming from the sea. Now I'm not just in some poetic mood here, but rather I'm using a metaphor as an introduction because I think that this image is really very good to express the subject of the forms of modernity, the spiritual forms of modernity, and some of the highest spiritual forms of modernity. And the one we'll talk about in this podcast is the form of writing, and to be more precise, one figure in the sand that's been erased now as we speak, or is erased already by the sea of time. The sea of progress of time, a sea of time that is understood as annihilator of all things. And this is the figure of a writer, the writer of prose, of novels, and so on. The writer as truth teller. Now this subject is very close to my heart for various reasons, and my own realizations about the disappearance of this form and of this figure, the figure of human being that transcends some limitations of everyday existence, is something that comes from my own experience, and is a realization, one of those realizations that are very personal and that are in a way costly, the realizations and insights that cost you something, that make you lose something, to put you in positions that you have to let go of your illusions, that I think that are most valuable insights and usually most dearly both. So I think I'll get unusually personal in this podcast. Now, when I was a kid, growing up in a decline of communist country, a specific socialist country with very specific culture, and by the way, with some really great novelists living in it and dying in it, of course. And at the end of the Cold War, I used to have as well as many of my people of my generation, this notion of great men, of great activities that human beings can employ to transcend kind of everyday existence of work, life, death. And one of those forms was art, specifically writing. The other was philosophy, for instance, the figure of philosopher. What I want to say is that these figures still meant something. And this is something that is, and I'll get back to it, specific to communism, which preserved some of the trappings of what I call classical modernity, of naive early modernity, where modernity still appeared to have retained the forms of classical, of traditional world, and at the same time progressed to humanity. Whereas, as we shall try to show in this podcast, this is complete contradiction. It's in fact impossible, and it's a real tragedy for us who grew up in modernity and are now in spiritual void of a sort. Anyway, those figures were something that you understood as given, and this is very important. So, for instance, great writer, you could aspire to become a great writer, because great writer was, we wouldn't say God-given. Most of great writers are atheists of some form. Can be something to aspire to, something you can become. Well, nowadays you cannot become a great writer. You can be a great writer, but you'll never become one, because publicly there is no place for you. There is no place for great writer, or I would even say writer in general, in original sense, which I'll try to explain momentarily. This place doesn't exist anymore, because modernity went further. The time and the epoch that gave birth to this figure, which is of very shallow historical roots, it just moved on and destroyed it, like a wave that erases the figure in the sandy beach. And every figure inscribed on the beach of this modern world is being erased faster and faster, and now they are disappearing altogether. Now nothing can be read anymore. Nothing shows or displays meaningful whole. Everything is just disappearing. But okay, we won't lament over nihilism here. We'll just try to clear-headedly explain something. So writer was understood in times of, let's say, mid-20th century, not in times of great modern novel, that is to say, the passage between 19th and 20th century, but later, when writers became self-aware, when society accepted writer as, even ultra-modern society, as American society has accepted writer as something, as someone who really matters, who is really important. Even such pragmatic society as mid-20th century USA, society that was focused on economic and political success and gained enormous political economic success, something that the world have probably never seen before. But it had its writers, its counterculture, even was called, as people like, I'm thinking about people like Jack Kerouac, but mainly I'm thinking of people like Ernest Hemingway, who was a public figure, who was to some even a war hero from World War I, Spanish Civil War, but well, that's arguable. Ultimate American writer, in my opinion, definitely so. A great writer, excellent writer by all accounts, especially when it comes to short stories. That was his, in my opinion, his best form. This figure was something you would aspire to be, don't you? Anybody listening to me who ever thought about writing now, think about a guy like Hemingway, for instance, and who wouldn't aspire to become such a figure? Sans suicide, but Hemingway probably had an inclination towards suicide in his family. Well, maybe you could become a great writer without this. This was the peak of modernity times, especially this time after World War II, with where all those forces that were important and world shaping in the past, in the 19th century and early 20th century, now became a kind of system. And by this I mean the existence of social rewards, for institutionalized social rewards for successful performance of the task of writing, of giving literary form to some kind of, to some contents, ideas, understanding of an epoch, understanding of one's own country, even if this understanding was that country or nation was a kind of mess or tragedy in the making. All of this was accepted, socially accepted, as a form of truth-telling that has something that is even akin to science in some sense. It's not scientific, but it has this value in itself and has to be supported. Now this is lost. Or if you believe that when, for instance, European Union gives grants for writing novels about very strict set of subjects, like, for instance, the plight of refugees from the from the Middle East in Europe, or how to transcend one's own identity, and so on and so forth, another kind of bullshit that is prevalent today. It is obvious that writing, in the sense that high modernity understood it, doesn't exist anymore as visible phenomena. It doesn't mean that you cannot write. You can. I had, certainly. And you can write, maybe if you are a real masochist and really try to attempt to develop this craft of writing, you can develop it theoretically to a level of people like Joseph Conrad or anybody from that age. But very few people will read it. And not only that, because a lot of great writers were read by few during their lives. Not all, not even majority. I think this is a prejudice, but good number of them. But that's not the issue. The issue is that even if you have a readership, you are irrelevant. Your writing is irrelevant as a form of telling the truth. Why? Well, modernity has passed. The magic bullet I always use, and as all magic bullets, it must have its shortcomings as an explanation, but I think in the end it really is what it is all about. Problem with modernity, modern people, is that they believe the world began with them and will end with them, and this is very symptomatic for modernity. And modernity is, in that sense, a dialectical clash of two irreconcilable opposites. That is to say, constant flux that is called progress, and firm belief in stability of the forms produced by that progress. And this is why I began with this metaphor or image of the lines in the sand, of the inscriptions and drawings in the sand, on the seashore, on the beach, because nothing displays modernity better than this. And this is precisely what it is. Because each time modernity develops a form, be it aesthetical, intellectual, cultural, political form, it will erase it sooner or later, and this erasure nowadays happens much quicker than it used to. and the progress, that is to say development, for instance, of technology, and invasion of technology in completely these last bastions of the being that cannot be technologized, as intimacy of soul, of intellect, only means that it is going at the speed of free fall. Well, we have to understand that all those great writers we may love and so on are part of this process. They are part of this. They are complicit in a way to this. And they had their time, and that time has passed. So that time is certainly spiritually more appealing than the void we have now. But there would be no void like this, I think, without that stylized and aestheticized void of the, for instance, 20th century, 19th century. Now it only lost its aesthetic appeal, and that's it. So, because if you read the message, you try to depict the message of the great modern writer, it's rather a nihilistic message, or at least of some kind of heroism in the face of nothingness, and so on and so forth. Well, now you have a result of what they predicted the world is going towards, and they were part of this decadence. So, in a metaphysical way, if you take a God's view, bird's view, let's say angel's view, nothing is lost, because this obviously had to happen, but from human perspective, earthly perspective, it's painful. Now it's a really, when you remember this past world, this post-communism world in Europe, and you walk on the beach. Let's talk about beaches again. In the summer, as I do, I'm not walking or working something with tourists, and you observe those masses of tattooed idiots of both sexes from all parts of Europe. Young people, middle-aged people, older people, all looking like children, paint books with those tattoos, with attempts to build up. Everybody ending up looking the same. And you remember the times when young people had artistic, for instance, aspiration, but truly artistic aspirations, not just for pose. But even if it was a pose, it was a different pose than this. Then you see how deeply the world has changed, and how shallow everything you learned as very young, as a kid, was. The deepest things you thought, the deepest aspiration of humanity, which are deepest aspiration of modernity, understood as something that is that applies to all ages, whereas it's not, are really very shallow, because they all ended up in this. And especially post-communist countries that are, even after 20 years without communism, still can be called post-communist, because they retain some connection to it. The best a best laboratory to figure this out, because there you see the modernity and previous times, earlier phases, were frozen in time, because society was highly conservative economically and politically. It didn't change, so a lot of things endured that were, in fact, as we can see now, destroyed in the West far before. So I know, for instance, in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia, you had this literary awards. Some of the writers who got them were not simply stooges to regime. They were really great writers. They were not writing propaganda. They were writing, in some cases, very subversive novels, subversive to socialism, but not really against socialism, not against modernity, for instance, not against, maybe not novels so much about ideas, but novels about persons, about questions of life and death and so on, that were excellent and that were recognized as excellent. That is impossible now. Now you cannot, in European Union, you cannot write a novel or short story or conceptual collection of short stories where not only where you don't, let alone thinking that you could write something that has this complete opposition to ruling ideology of the EU system. You cannot write anything that is not affirming it in some way, that is not affirming prejudices of the age. Any kind of rebellion, and especially if there is a moment of rebellion, this is impossible. You can publish it on samizdat, on internet, but internet is degradation of literature. I can't believe that real literature should be in physical writing. You cannot find the audience easily, and I don't think that people who tattoo their bodies top to bottom read a lot, although they like themselves to be read, because I noticed some people write the whole passages in tattoos, so you have to stare to try to read what is written, and they ask you why you're staring. Because my answer would be because you are a fucking idiot. So what you gonna do? I'm sorry, I really really can't stand tattooed idiots. That is to say, I can't stand a lot of people today. This is a separate subject, and this is a worthwhile subject in itself, this mania of tattooing, but we'll leave it at that now. We will conclude with saying that the figure of a writer is a very good example of the erosion of modernity and what we often talk and write about, or call it trivial, where you can really see this, how things, valuable things of modern age easily fall apart and end up reduced to nothing, and how one should look beyond them, because they are all expression of earlier forms, spiritual forms, or forms of human existence, that they detached from their origin, in some sense, to give them, perhaps it was the idea in the beginning, or rather instinct in the beginning, to give them greater freedom, but ended up in solitude. So, I think that would be a good appetizer for thought, because it is podcasts one cannot be exactly more than that. I hope you found this interesting. Once more apologizes for low activity on Calitrivium, but there is unfortunately one summer. Thank you.